Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're comparing the Ryzen 5 7400F with the i5 12400F. Both of the 6-core 12-thread chips are the cheapest on their respective platforms. The 7400F is a low-cost AM5 CPU and the 12400F is a low-cost 1700 CPU. Of course, right out of the box, one advantage of the i5 is that it can be used with either DDR4 or DDR5 motherboards, whereas the 7400F is limited to DDR5. The 7400F also has a higher boost frequency, but it is going to run warmer because of the thermal paste underneath the IHS, and it's not going to be as widely available. You're probably going to have to source one of these on AliExpress, occasionally eBay. The 12400F is the more widely available chip, tried and tested as it were. And when it comes to the 7400F, you might find that where you live, it's not actually much more to get the 7500F instead, and we've compared the 7500F and 12400F in the past. But let's see how these two compare, and we'll start with the CPU intensive tests. So in Cinebench 2024, the Ryzen hit 100.791 in terms of the single and multi-core results, whereas the i5 came in slightly better with 103 for that single core result, but slightly worse off in terms of the multi-core result, 103 and 700 compared to 100 and 791. When it comes to real-world usage then, this translates to a slight difference, to say the least, with rendering times in DaVinci Resolve. The 7400F was a lot quicker, rendering a 1080p 60 FPS video in just 38 seconds compared to the i5 12400F, which did it in 48. Still a respectable time, but definitely a noticeable difference between the two. Now then, let's move on to some games. I'm using a 5070 Ti at 1080p to get the most out of these CPUs. I'm not one to really test at lower settings, I just use the settings that I'd probably opt for anyway, but we are still going to notice a difference across the board as the CPUs in all of the scenarios basically today were the limiting factor, and that's what we want, of course, from a CPU test. Now with Call of Duty then, we saw 123 FPS on average with the Ryzen, a 1% low of 80 and a 0.1% low of 27. The i5 came in slightly worse with 106, a 1% low of 66 and a 0.1% low of 26. The 0.1% figure wasn't actually too different at all, within margin of error territory, but the game did feel a lot smoother to play on the newer Ryzen CPU. Atomfall, a new release that I'm really enjoying here, 1080p Ultra. This runs really well on a wide range of hardware, at least from what I've tested so far. On the Ryzen 5 we saw 221 FPS, a 1% low of 108 and a 0.1% low of 94. The figures were slightly worse off with the i5, 213, 107 and 96. So again, in terms of those percentile lows, it was pretty close. When you're dealing with frame rates that are as high as these two on average anyway, you're not really going to feel a difference when actually playing. And although there's 8 or so FPS difference between the two on average, it was a very respectable job from both processors. As the i5 is the older chip, it's always nice to see it holding up so well these days, though there are certainly some situations whereby it's going to be quite the limitation when paired with a higher end graphics card like this. I apologise for the Counter-Strike 2 gameplay, it's not exactly the same on both sides of the screen, but I actually ran a custom benchmark to ensure that our results were fair here, and the footage you're seeing is just from Dust 2 gameplay because it's more entertaining than a boring walk around the map. But the Ryzen 5 hit 351 with a 1% low of 105 and a 0.1% low of 83. The i5 on the other hand, 318, 110 and 102. So although that average was quite a bit lower, the game was actually a little smoother on Intel's CPU here, and that can be seen from the percentile figures. It certainly felt a little smoother to play as well. Now I'm using DDR5 6400 MHz RAM for both of these CPUs, but as I said, the i5 can also make use of DDR4, and it means that if you want to pair it with a DDR4 board, maybe you've got an older motherboard already, you're looking to save as much money as possible, then you've just got a few more options with the Intel chip. And in terms of performance differences between DDR4 and DDR5, it's going to depend on the speeds and the game, of course. When it came to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, wasn't really much difference in it, to be honest. About 4 FPS on average, 144 for the Ryzen and 140 for the i5. The 0.1% low, the 1 and 0.1% lows were where we saw more of a noticeable change with the FPS numbers, but to be honest, this really isn't a difference that you're going to notice when actually playing either, and I'd say both CPUs did a pretty respectable job with this one. You will notice though that the Ryzen 5 consumes a little more power and it runs warmer. This is with the same Thermalright Assassin King 120 SE cooler, and I think one of the reasons for that is because the Ryzen 5 7400F uses a thermal paste between the CPU die and the heat spreader itself, so you're going to see higher temperatures. I've not seen anything that's particularly worrisome as of yet, but if you're looking for a chip that runs a little cooler and therefore your CPU fan isn't going to ramp up as high, then the i5 certainly wins it in that regard. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition up next, 1080p with a very high RT preset, 136 for the Ryzen 7400F, a 1% low of 77 and a 0.1% low of 68. For the i5 we saw 131, 81 and 66. So again, the averages weren't too different here. But I think in terms of the percentile lows, the performance overall was slightly in favour of the i5, at least in terms of that 1% low, but wasn't much difference at all between the 0.1% figures. Again, this isn't a difference that you're going to feel when playing either of these CPUs are certainly up for the job here. They're both going to make you very happy if you want to put together a lower cost gaming rig. Finally then we'll end on Cyberpunk 2077 1080p Ultra here, 104 for the R5, 57 as that 1% low and 48 as that 0.1% low. For the i5 12400F, 102 on average, a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 49. So these are probably the closest figures that we've seen today, and overall both chips are pretty solid. I'd be inclined to opt for the i5 if you want something that's going to run a little cooler. You also do have an upgrade path, of course, especially if you purchase a half decent motherboard. You can upgrade to say an i7 or i9 later down the line. Same can be said for the Ryzen 5 on the AM5 platform. It's a newer platform. You're going to have access to the latest and greatest Ryzen chips should you want to upgrade a little later on. It is worth bearing in mind that the 7500F, however, isn't going to be that much more expensive. On sites like AliExpress, it depends on where you live, of course. I managed to find a 7400F on eBay for about £20 or £30 cheaper than I could find a 7500F. So I think in that case, it was worth it for the money I saved. I'll have to do a more in-depth comparison of the 7400F and 7500F. We touched on that in the 7400F video previously, so I recommend going to watch that and watching the 7500F versus 12400F video too if you want to. But as for this one, pretty close match, to be honest. Both of these 6-core budget CPUs are decent, but there are certainly benefits to both. Let me know what you think down below in the comments section. Thanks for watching as always, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.